I would like to welcome you all to our first reparations live discussion. My name is James Boston. I'm the founder of the Association of Former British Colonies. Myself and my colleague, one of whom will be speaking today, are very much interested in examining the legacies of the British Empire and understanding how they fit into a modern day context through educational content and social dialogue. I'm joined today by 6 guest speakers who will be presenting different perspectives on the case for reparations. Our title question today is, does Britain owe reparations? For some people, the case for reparations is inadequate. Their argument is that matters of history should be left in the past and moved on, that we should learn from them, but that no present day action is necessary. For other people, their experience of inequality is rooted in colonial practices and procedures which favored some at the expense of others. Recently, this week in fact, we have seen Bristol Council pass a motion in favor of reparations. This month, we have also seen the US Congress debating whether or not to pass a bill which would examine the African American case for reparations. On the other hand, in 2015, former British Prime Minister David Cameron ruled out reparations by suggesting that it is time to move on. Regardless of where you stand, the question of reparations is reigniting and becoming a more prevalent question in society. To help us answer and examine this further, I would like to invite our first guest speaker, Natessia Bohard Singh, to address this question. Natessia, if you just unmute your microphone, thank you.
Greetings, everyone, and thank you so much, James. It is indeed an auspicious occasion to be in any space to speak on behalf of my ancestors. And I say my ancestors because I am one of the descendants of the 15 million Africans taken to this part of the land. I'm from Jamaica, I'm in Jamaica. And I just want to say that even more so auspicious in this month, having this event, is that the month of March, we celebrate Zero Discrimination Day. That was March 1, International Women's Day, March 8, International Day for the Elimination of Racial Discrimination, coming up March 21. And most fitting for this discussion, the International Day for the Remembrance of the Victims of Slavery and the Transatlantic Slave Trade, that is March 25th. I want to use this opportunity also to extend thanks to the Association of Former British Colonies for utilizing your platforms to ventilate these issues, important issues affecting the population left on these islands, formerly owned and now operated through constitutional monarchy-style governance by the colonial powers. My role is to speak to the clear case for reparatory justice for the victims, descendants of the transatlantic slave trade and indigenous peoples of the Caribbean and their descendants. And I am saying that because we do not always seem to recognize the indigenous people of the Caribbean and their descendants, given the distorted views of history, the genocidal conditions, but they are still alive in Dominicas and other countries, and they must be recognized, and reparatory justice must also be sought for them. I do not speak for the National Council on Reparation, the Center for Reparation, or CARICOM, though I am a consultant to the NCR and the CRR. But as I said earlier, I speak as a defendant of the 15 million enslaved Africans, and as a lawyer, historian, scholar, activist who have spent the majority of my adult life interrogating the uninterrogated and perfecting my moral obligation to my ancestors to always remember. So I speak today on behalf of the ancestors and those of us who continue to suffer. The case is that the African is a wronged race that has not received even an apology for those who committed the most brutal crimes against us. Although our case is well laid out with both historical and ongoing evidence to substantiate the claim, still not even an apology. From my perspective, and from those of us who signal reparatory justice for the enslaved and indigenous population, we have managed to embark on extensive research. We have managed to overview the historical facts, and we've come up with 3 significant and equally important elements to make the case in front of any tribunal, anywhere, at any time. We have identified the crime. We have identified the victims, which we put together as the claimants, and the defendants. Now, the claimants, the victims as identifiable groups are distinct. Over 400-year period of African chattel slavery, it is estimated that 15 million Africans were stolen from their homes and forcibly transported and relocated to the Caribbean as enslaved chattel and property of Europeans. As a result of the brutal conditions of slavery, when the odious system came to an end in the late 19th century, less than 2 million people of African descent remained from those genocidal practices. The trade in enslaved bodies and the practice of enslavement were highly commercial businesses for certain nations in Europe. In the countries of the Caribbean were confined to the roles of producers and exporters by a system designed to extract value from the region to create maximum wealth in Europe. Much of the wealth that exists in those nations today in Europe is the creation of that system of human and economic exploitation on which there's no statute of limitation. Also, as a result of European conquest and colonization, the indigenous people within the member states of CARICOM have been subjected to forced migration within country and across region, to brutal work condition and genocide. Indigenous peoples were brutalized. The facts show and killed. The facts record that they were militarized, seized, their lands were seized. Out of the 3 million people in 1700, remained 30,000 in the year 2000. This led to the destruction of not just bodies, but languages, culture, heritage, irreparable damage to an entire generation. The identified defendants are also documented. They are in the form of European colonizers and traders. So far, we have identified Denmark, France, Germany, the Netherlands, Norway, Sweden, Switzerland, Spain, Portugal, and of course, the United Kingdom of Great Britain. The case against Britain. Evidence collected by the Center for Reparation will tell you that Britain played a dominant role in the enslavement of Africans. The brutal nature of the great tragedy and the demographic disaster that was plantation slavery was a feature of Britain's livelihood. It was estimated that a total of 5.5 million Africans were trafficked to the British colonized Caribbean over 2 centuries. But by the time 1834 came around, just 800 remained. It spoke to the brutal conditions on Britain plantation, the lack of treating enslaved population as humans. It is seen that it was up until the end of the slave trade in 1807 that any attention was given to repopulating, because the enslaved bodies were used and discarded because they could always go back and get more Africans to come. In case studying Jamaica, it is seen that Jamaica was under British rule for 183 years of enslavement from 1655 to 1838. Thereafter, 1962 as a colony of Britain, and to the present as the constitutional head of state. Between 1750 and 1807, when the trade in enslaved people were abolished, Britain dominated the buying and selling of enslaved people to the Americas. Persons were seized from different parts of Africa and transported against their will for sale to settlers to work on plantations in enslavement, deprived of their dignity like any other piece of machinery of the agricultural industry and operated by the planters. The estimated 1.5 million who arrived in Jamaica were dispersed to plantations throughout the island in enslavement, undiscriminating on origin, status, culture, and language. As strangers to each other, they worked side by side for the economic benefit of the planters in Jamaica and in Britain. Now, their enslavement under British rule lasted, as I said, for 183 difficult years, working without compensation or compassion, without hope or relief from their misery until death or by manumission by an act of the UK Parliament. Today, Britain celebrates its prosperity while an entire population of people in these island states are bemoaning a past of mankind's greatest tragedy. Finally, in making the element, what is the crime? All the European member states, we're saying, UK at the top of the list, are parties to the claim for reparative justice. They have instructed genocidal actions upon indigenous communities. They have created the legal, financial, and fiscal policies necessary for the enslavement of the Africans. They have defined and enforced African enslavement and native genocide as in their national interest. They have refused compensation to the enslaved with the ending of their enslavement. They have imposed a further 100 years of racialized apartheid upon the emancipated and refused to acknowledge such crimes or to compensate victims and their descendants. Today, we're seeing, especially when it comes to the pandemic and all the spin-off to a global crisis, we're seeing evidence showcasing a situation of developing nations unable to cope with the ever-changing global phenomena. It is a fact that the descendants of native Caribbean people and the descendants of enslaved Africans post-slavery experiences are poverty, marginalization, and social exclusion. This remains true today as the institutionalized racism of the colonial era has had a debilitating impact on Africans and people of African descent. In essence, colonialism has economically disenfranchised us all. We demand reparation. We demand reparation, and let us be clear, when we say we demand reparation, we are not making an ask. We're not making an ask for grants, for aid from European nations, more specifically from the UK. Reparation is not asking for handout. Reparation to the victims and descendants of the transatlantic slave trade and the victims of native genocide and indigenous population is not asking for loans or favors to be extended towards the developing world. The demand for reparation is just that, a demand for what is owed. Reparation is defined as redressing a wrong. It is a term applied to money or other compensation made to other international entities. The concept of reparation is not alien. So when we hear persons saying, get over it, or that is just something unheard of, that is not so. I am here to put on the table that international law recognizes that nations or individuals who have wronged other nations or individuals should make reparation. The Permanent Court of International Justice holds that reparation must wipe out all the consequences of the illegal act and reestablish the situation which would, in all probability, have existed if the act had not been committed. The World Conference Against Racism, Racial Inequality, Discrimination, Xenophobia, and Related Intolerance in September 2011 declared that slavery and the slave trade are crime against humanity and should have always been. So especially the transatlantic slave trade. And finally, let me put forward that the concept of reparation was never alien to Britain, the US, or the European thinking, but it shows up when we speak about Africans. We speak about what is due to us. It shows up that racism is still alive and well. Who dare the Black people to want to seek repair? But there, on the other hand, Germany paid Israel an estimated $60 billion for the exigencies of the Holocaust in Nazi Germany. Nobody objected to that. Japanese Americans received an apology and $20,000 per person from the US for unjust racial discrimination treatment. Nobody opposed to that. The US also made reparation payments to Native American Indians of $1.3 billion and large areas of reserves as a result of their claim to reparation. No objections to that. I can go on because I want for persons to understand that racism is why we are still here at the table talking about what we are owed and what we deserve. I will hold for questions. I hope I did not go over my time. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Natesia, that was a very passionate speech with lots of facts and statistics. And I would encourage our audience, if you have any questions for Natesia or any of the speakers going forward, please put them in our YouTube chat section, and that can be forwarded to our speakers during our allocated question and answer session. Thank you very much, Natesia. Our next speaker who I would like to invite to come forward is Britain Owe. Vidhu, if you could unmute your microphone, and the stage is yours.
Can you hear me? Yeah, thank you, James. I'd like to begin on a light-hearted note by saying well done to you for organizing this meeting on a day that India has given England a proper pasting at cricket. Obviously, thank you to everyone else who's listening in. I'm going to begin by quoting to you some words written by an American author and historian about 100 years ago. Will Durant is his name, and he referred to empire in India as the deliberate bleeding of India by England. And he went on to say that this is the greatest crime in all history, all history. So I completely agree. Now, if I completely agree, then why am I against the question of reparations, which has been so cogently argued by Natesia? Before I answer that, I want to just explain why I call myself or describe myself as a lost child of empire. I'm a child of empire because of my connections to Kenya. I was born in 1960 when it was still a colony, just emerging from the brutal suppression of the Mau Mau uprising. And I am a child of empire because my grandfather left India 125 years ago to work on the Ugandan railway line, building a railway in Kenya to the shores of Lake Victoria. I'm lost because although I've lived more than almost 5 decades in the UK, I regard my primary allegiance to be to India and my other motherland of Kenya. And that makes me feel guilty that I'm not more grateful to a country, the UK, which has educated me, paid for my education as a doctor, worked in a nice middle-class arena for 30 years, and now earning a decent pension from the British government. But anyway, that mention of Kenya leads me nicely into my first reason for being against reparations, which is that when we mention racism, I'm afraid this is not a completely simple matter of the white people of Europe being the guilty, evil ones, and the non-white people of the developing world being innocent, because the truth is a little bit more complicated. I'm ashamed to say that my own memories of the Indian community in Kenya are that the Indians were racist in their treatment of the local Africans, whose country it is. It's a sort of apartheid that occurred all over empire, British at the top, white people, black people at the bottom, and then an intermediate race in the middle, races in the middle. But even worse, when you switch to my other country, motherland of India, it's not just the British who have perpetrated great harm, because before the British came were waves of invasions going back to the 8th century. And, you know, talking about countries like Arabia, Afghanistan, Iran, Turkey, and the Central Asian countries that we today know as Uzbekistan and Kazakhstan, etc. Untold brutalities were perpetrated by them. 80 million Indians died during that period. So that's the first thing. It's not going to be simple to identify who is guilty, and it could end up in this crazy situation of a lot of countries suing each other. Now, similarly, when we talk about who is guilty, then also is the question of when does it all start? How far back in time do you go before you draw a line in the sand and say that it's only after such and such a date that we will consider this issue? Why only 250 years? If you're talking about justice, why not 500 years to include all the countries that Natasja mentioned, such as Spain and Portugal? But then again, why not 1,000, 1,500 years to include all the Middle Eastern countries that I mentioned? So, you know, how far do you go back? Now, the other point briefly about why I'm against reparations is essentially the practicality of it, which is, how do you measure the harm that has occurred? Now, I know an American university only last year calculated that $45 trillion is the amount of money or wealth that was looted by Britain from India. Yeah, but that's only loot. How about, how can you possibly quantify financially the cost of millions of lives, millions? Rape, how do you quantify that? And when you look at figures such as 45 trillion, the other point then is about being pragmatic. These are unaffordable sums. And from a practical viewpoint, the reason I'm against reparations is because the only winner in all of this will be, I'm afraid, the lawyers. You know, these cases will go to the international courts. Lawyers will laugh all the way to the bank, you know, over a decade or so that the cases will be prosecuted. And in the end, a disdainful, derisive sum will be awarded, which I think is even worse than getting nothing, because it's, you know, rubbing salt into the wounds of the victims. And I have evidence for that, because quite recently, about 6 or 7 years ago, going back to my country of original country of Kenya, survivors of the Mau Mau uprising did take Britain to the courts, the High Court of England, and an out-of-court settlement was made in which £20 million was awarded to the claimants. Now, that might seem quite a big sum, but the number of claimants were 5,000. So if you do a quick sum, that is £4,000 per person, less than 4,000 in actual fact it was, which I think is insulting. Not even 40,000, probably 400,000 would have been fair per person, but it's not going to happen. You're just going to have these gestures made, which I think are really the worst outcome of all. So in the couple of minutes that I've got left, I want to answer the question, should we do nothing? And the answer is most definitely not, because this is far too serious a matter, which has been so articulately argued by Natasja, that we can't just sweep it under the carpet. So what I would say is that, of course, there is, from the viewpoint of India, there's one thing that I would want to happen under the category of non-interference of other countries. Here I want to mention that one of the biggest drivers of colonization was religious evangelism. It was the desire to convert the pesky natives, the heathens, the Kafirs, to Christianity. And when you look at, this is an important point, if you look at all the pre-Bronze Age civilizations that flourished in the world, that is more than 3,000 years ago, all of them have been wiped out except for one. You know, you look at the Americas, the Aztecs, the Incas, the Mayas, the North American, what were called Indians. You look at that wonderful civilization of Egypt. You look at the Iraqi, Mesopotamian, Iranian, Zoroastrian civilization completely wiped out. And then you've got, even to this date, Tibet, Buddhism, Chinese Communist Party. We know what they're doing to the Uyghur Muslims in Xinjiang. So I want to try and persuade you here that there is one good reason why the Indian civilization is the only one which has survived, and that is its original spirituality, which goes back to time immemorial, the Vedic Dharma. And what I would really appeal to the world is that the ongoing interference, religious interference with countries such as India stops, because even today, the American church is spending billions in trying to convert poor Indians to Christianity. And we know what Islamism is up to in that part of the world, Kashmir and the Middle East. And I'm afraid this is something that has to stop. And I make no apologies for being an ardent supporter of Hindutva, which is a misnomer. All that simply means is that I hope I've persuaded you that the Sanatan Dharma of India is truly eternal and universal, which is why it is the only one that has survived. And it is time that foreign countries butt out, you know, these religions, if I must mention Christianity and Islam, really need to desist from that sort of evangelical behavior. And essentially, the reason I make this point is that this non-interference is exactly what all the victim countries need, because you could then apply the same principle to financial, trade, economic, commercial exploitation, which is ongoing, as did the United States par excellence in the last century, and what the Chinese Communist Party is up to today. So I think I've gone over time, so forgive me for that. Thank you for listening.
Thank you very much, Vidhu. And for those of our audience who do have any questions for Vidhu, please put them in the chat and we will answer them in our allotted time section. Next speaker that I would like to invite to come forward is Geeta Lal, and she will be making the case that India does, or Britain does owe reparations. So here you are, Geeta.
Hi, so first of all, I want to say thank you for inviting me to this platform. I'm here on behalf of In Society, and we are a racial justice platform. We aim to educate, support and advocate for people of colour, young people of colour, and educate in like cultural, political and economics. And so that's that's the reason why I'm here today. So I'm very excited to be talking about the case of reparations, because I was converted in this element. So I initially thought, we haven't got the money. And then I kind of went into history, and we know a bit about the kind of contracts we've done, where the UK has spent billions and nothing's really come from those contracts recently. So clearly we've got money. but we're just willing to spend it where we want to spend it and not in reparations. So I want to talk a little bit about the history, but before I do that, there is till this day, Britain in any manner has never apologized for any of its history. And the reason for that is because they know there is a case for reparations as soon as that happens. And there was an MP that was interviewed with Afua Hirsch who made an admittance to that. So even MPs recognise that there's a case there, but don't want to apologise, so that case doesn't get brought forward. So I want to talk a little bit about the history of India. And when I talk about India, I'm talking about pre-partition India. So that is inclusive of Pakistan and Bangladesh. And so when we look at the history of India, Britain came over to India and excuse me, I'll look at some notes, but Britain came over to India and was the first external country to buy land on India as part of the East Indian Company. And we progressively colonized India via this company over 300 years. I say we, I mean Britain. And so it's important to also note that Queen Victoria had a hand in this, the royal family had a hand in this. And so she signed the papers to say, yeah, you can purchase that land and allowed this to happen. And this later on went on to the British Raj, and England just continued to kind of colonize. And during the partition, there was 15 million people displaced. And then on top of that, we had 1 to 2 million people died, and this was during the train massacre. There was mass murder via trains during traveling, and Britain knew about that. They washed their hands though. They were just like, well, we've done what we wanted to do, wanted to leave, and they emphasized on the religious divides that were there, so to do with Muslims and Hindus. And so that's the reason why today there's a huge amount of Pakistanis that are Muslim and a huge amount of Indians that are here Hindus, because of the religious divides that England forced on India. But also to this day, there's a war at Kashmir. There's a consistent war that's been happening, and there's no one else to blame but in England and Britain. And so how do you kind of compensate for those deaths, right? When there's, up until this day, modern day 2021, we're still people are still dying at the border. And I think the other thing as well to notice, that politicians, so people, so Churchill is revered as this man that can never be spoken ill of, and we saw that when there was the heights of the Black Lives Matter movement and statues were being taken down, and it was brought into question about Churchill and his history. And whilst I admit Churchill, in terms of World War, he got us out of that. We can't look at it in one lens and just say, well, he was a great hero and we should be thankful. Well, actually, out of the 5 famines that pre-partition India had, there was only one, scientists said there was only one that was a direct impact of England alone. The other famines were because of soil and weather and all that kind of stuff happened. This one specifically was because of England. And so 3 to 4 million Bengalis died in that in 1943. And we talk about this like it was ages ago. 1943 was not that long ago. That was World War II. And the reason for that is because they used their resources to feed Britain instead. And historians actually say that there would have been enough. They would have been able to feed India too. And so there was actually no need for this. The way that this happened, it was unreal. And yeah, like you mentioned earlier, it was 45 trillion that was measured, that was taken from India. The other bit as well is that people often say, well, we gave India the trains, right? We gave them the trains, and so they should be thankful. Well, no, you didn't. India could make trains themselves. You forced them to make the trains, made them pay for them in extortionate amounts, and then use those trains to steal from them. So it was a bit, it was awful what England did, and it's not funny, but I just think the whole concept that people think that trains were a gift to India is awful. But on top of that, England, and I think to this day, I think the biggest symbol of what is needed to India is the Kohinoor diamond. in the crown, and that's worth 140 to 400 million. And the amount of, it's been ages been asked, that needs to be sent back. And it hasn't. I mean, the gold as well. So India's been quite well known for its Indian gold. There was a lot taken. So in summary, I believe that India deserves reparations because of the level of things that Britain did. However, I recognize that, yeah, how do you put a number on death? But I think even asking that question while saying, well, we shouldn't really give reparations because you can't put a number on death, is like, okay, so my family member's just died. If someone killed my family member, but I didn't find out about it at the time, we find out years later, and I'm in my 70s, 80s, and we find out this person was murdered. Does it then mean that actually it was ages ago, we don't need to prosecute the murder because we found out way later, it doesn't really matter anymore? No, my family still deserves compensation for that. And so, yes, I recognize that 45 trillion is a lot of money, but we're still getting money from countries that we colonized and then got them to loan off us. And that's seen as okay. I just think that we need to do more. We need to give money, we need to give opportunities, and that's just through to modern day people living here as well, Indians. And you can see that from Pakistanis and Bangladeshis living in the UK have some of the worst economic backgrounds and stuff here, living here because of that. But also there's that displacement. Like, I don't know a lot about my history from living here, right? And I feel like the education is somewhat propaganda in the way that we only teach it from one side. So I think it's through education, through opportunities, and through finances is where we need to give money back. I think I've just gone over time, so yeah.
Thank you very much. That was really interesting insights into the South Asian experience, or pre-partitioned Indian experience, and the case for reparations there. Guys, if you have any questions for Geeta, please again put them in the comments section. Our next speaker is Robert Williams, and he'll be making the case against reparations. Robert, I would like to invite you to unmute your microphone.
Can you hear me? Fantastic. First, I wish to thank James Boston and the Association of Former British Colonies for sponsoring today's live discussion on the issue of reparations, and for inviting me to contribute a case against Britain owing reparations. As a citizen of former British colonies whose colonial governments united to rebel against the Crown and an elitist parliament in 1776 to become the United States of America, parts of my ancestry can be traced to Robert Jones, a Welsh Quaker of Worcester, who left for the North American colonies only months after Cromwell's troops killed 3,000 of the Crown's Scottish troops. And to Havana Cottrell, my great-great-great-grandmother from Yoruba, Africa, amongst many others. During the past decade, we have seen a real explosion in the effects of structural racism against people of African and other non-European descent. So I welcome this opportunity to debate the wisdom of reparations, especially for British citizens and Commonwealth persons of African descent who continue to suffer from legacies of slavery, and whether, quote, Britain, unquote, has an obligation, legal or otherwise, to facilitate reparations. One way of discussing this issue is from a common law, tort law damages perspective. Although people from either side of the European constructed enterprise of chattel slavery are now deceased, there is something in English legal models that addresses the damages suffered by victims. Originally under common law, a person's claim against another for damages died with that person. But eventually, the voting 3% in England decided this was a legal loophole that was in need of plugging. For example, a murdered victim is unable to bring a tort action against her or his murderer for damages, for the simple reason that the victim is dead. The voting 3% in England recognized this deficiency in the common law during the 1840s, and they addressed it by statute, which empowered beneficiaries to make claims for damages on behalf of a person who suffered damages but is deceased. Later, added to this was the idea of restitution for unjust enrichment. Now, we also must discern who are the people that actually did the slavery. When we ask, does Britain owe reparations, we must define the term Britain. The vast majority of the Celts and English peoples of the British Isles had no role in that. 97% could not even vote on the laws that made it possible. Yet the vast majority of the English public, they had no say in any lawmaking until 1867, 60 years after the Parliament of the voting 3% passed an act of the abolition of the slave trade, and 2 years after African Americans won suffrage in the USA. If we define Britain as the British Empire, which did not abolish slavery in its colonies until 1833, this is still 34 years before the majority of white British could vote on the laws they and everyone else suffered under. How do we define Britain and British Empire? Are they simply the Crown and Parliament? Where then will the Crown or Parliament get the monetary funds today that would become reparations? Apart from revenues that they collect from the working majority of the population, the British government has no independent source of wealth. Contemporary descendants of the non-voting 97% prior to suffrage in 1867, who suffered the laws and class discriminations promulgated by the voting 3% until 1867, would bear the true burden of reparations today. For the descendants of the disenfranchised English and Celts during chattel slavery to bear the financial burden of reparations seems unjust. They could not vote until 1867 for non-farm laboring males and 1919 for women and farm laboring males. Asking them to fund reparations will stir resentment in people who perceive themselves to have had nothing to do with slavery or writing the laws that promoted it. The voting 3% created a class-divided society where white Celts were relegated to the bottom as, quote, white apes, unquote. As wage slaves without a vote, the disenfranchised majority seldom received a day's pay for a day's work or safety equipment to work safely. Jail fees for incarceration as penalty for petty offenses promulgated by the voting 3% was billed weekly, with accrued incarceration for non-payment. The only escape for many was to sign up for indentured servitude in His Majesty's Prison North America, which was extremely dangerous and volatile. The homicide rate was 20 times higher in the North American colonies than it is in today's United States of America. And this was before the breech-loading firearm was invented. This is not to say that homicide rates are low today in the USA. Every year, Yanks shoot each other dead at over 11,000 a year compared to 39 gun homicides in the UK during 2011. After the American colonies closed in 1776, British victims of the voting 3%'s laws were kept imprisoned in ships at harbor for over 2 years until the Crown's Prison Tasmania and later Prison Australia were opened. The insanity suffered from those suffrageless British incarcerated in prison ships saw the incarcerated erupt from their confinement to murder every indigenous Tasmanian without legal repercussions. Their madness was unleashed again upon Australia's original peoples, yet there was no escape from the insanity, the PTSD, and the effects of resulting dysfunction passed down through generations on both sides. Another problem is how to determine who is eligible for reparations. There are no beneficiaries of the Tasmanians to even collect reparations. Is someone with 2% Yoruba and 98% Western European entitled to the same total per person reparation as someone who is 100% Yoruba? What about Africans in the UK that are not descendants of slaves? The only just system of compensation as reparations is one that does not force those who had no vote, no say, nothing to do with the laws that created slavery, having to pay damages. Rather, the 3% who selected members of parliament and approved reparations to slave owners for giving up slaves, and their beneficiaries should be the ones to dip into their pockets to fund these yet to be decided reparations. Forcing descendants of non-African victims of the 3% to fund the African victims of the 3% seems unjust. This, in a nutshell, is the case against British people owing reparations as it is currently conceived. The reformist zeal to address the cultural and structural legacies of racism within Britain's technocultures and society is commendable. But to blame the working class also suffering without the right to vote during chattel slavery seems morally unfathomable. Some of these individuals played heroic roles in wresting political and legislative power from the voting 3%. Targeting their descendants to fund reparations rather than or in addition to the beneficiaries of the 3% seems wrong. In conclusion, I ask, are reparations from the beneficiaries of the voting 3% even possible? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Robert. That was very thought-provoking. I'm aware that we have a few questions from our audience, and for those of you that are watching, we will be addressing those questions at the end. So please stay tuned for that time. Next, I would like to invite Clyde to speak. Clyde's a good friend of mine. We've known each other for a number of years, and we've had many conversations on this topic. So Clyde, if you'd like to unmute your microphone, and the platform is yours.
Can you hear me now? Okay. As James said, I'm Clyde, and I would like to thank you, James, for inviting me to participate in this discussion. It's a discussion that I've had with many people in the past, including the late Member of Parliament for Brent. Many of you may or may not have heard of him, a chap, a very fiery chap called Bernie Grant. And he is the only person that I know of that has actually raised this in Parliament. And him and I also had many heated debates around the subject. To give you a bit of background, I was born in Barbados, a tiny island in the Caribbean. And I was actually born on in the tenements of the now, I guess, more famous estate, sugar estate called Drax Hall, which is in St. George, in the parish of St. George, in the center of Barbados. And why is it now attracting attention? First of all, this estate was where sugar was introduced into Barbados. They started to grow the sugarcane. And it was owned by the Drax family from Dorset. And just recently, an organization known as Stand Up to Racism Dorset asked the Tory MP Richard Drax, who represents South Dorset, to relinquish his ownership of the estate, returning it to Barbadians as an act of reparation. That was not a Caribbean organization That's an organization right on his doorstep. So that's a bit of background knowledge. I went to the local boys' school, went to the high school, or one of the high schools in the city, and I came to the UK when I was 15 years old. I think also that what would be relevant is that the local estate, Vauxhall, is still making substantial funds for the Drax family who live in their stately home in Dorset. So that sets the scene. While I would say his workers on the plantation probably earning less than £5 an hour. So there you go. Over the last 40 years, I've been involved in the flat glass industry. And at one point, I employed over 140 people in my own factory. So I've had a lot of experience in business, in social enterprise, through my work in setting up various organizations to help to empower our people in the communities around Birmingham. So, does Britain owe reparations? Well, I am not going to argue with those who would argue against it. I would just argue for it. And why? Certainly in the case of the Caribbean, Blacks have been way too badly treated. I would say that, well, most people I hope would agree that slavery is a brutal and profound dehumanization of Black people in the Caribbean, the Americas, and subsequently the world, because it created a hierarchy where whites were at the top and Blacks at the bottom. All the others, brown, Chinese, whatever, in the middle. So the Blacks were at the bottom, and this structure continued from slavery. This structure was created in slavery, and it continues today. So the Blacks are at the bottom, and they're being looked down upon by all the others. This structure was what can only be described as white supremacy. As a result, this brutal legacy now permeates the life of all Black people across the world. People of color, in between, particularly the Blacks, continue to suffer endemic discrimination in all walks of life. Employment, housing, education, health, income, wealth, home ownership, to name but a few. This has led to institutional racism as well. Reparation can take various forms. And I guess some may say cash is best. But even that starts another debate of who do you pay the cash to. This then takes us down another narrative and away from the main point of achieving recognition and compensation for what has been done by slavery. Reparation was paid to the slave owners. So how can we deny reparation to Blacks? And in recent times here in Britain, we were informed by HMRC actually, that we all contributed to paying reparation to the slave owners. So Britain has already set a precedent for reparation by the payment of the slave owners. This was a sum so large that the government had to borrow money from the treasury and raise a tax levy to repay. HMRC recently informed us that we all contributed to the freedom of the slaves in 1834 when the last loan payment was made in 2015. In today's value, it would be in excess of 100 billion. The descendants of slaves living in this country had to help in paying off the slave owners. So this established a principle of reparation. It was the slaves who had suffered the indignity of being stolen from their own homes in Africa, shipped across the Atlantic in the most inhumane conditions, resulting in being sold into slavery and given free hard labor to the slave owners for over 300 years. Many of Britain's establishments, such as churches, banking, insurance, and great cities, benefited by having association with slave owners or involved in the slave trade direct. And the likes of Richard Drax, as mentioned previously. I think both the Drax family and David Cameron's family, who were active in the Caribbean. I think David Cameron's family were in Jamaica primarily, and Richard Drax's family were in Barbados. And they're still benefiting from the proceeds of slavery. In addition, the slaves were fed a diet of cheap food made up of salt meat, mainly pork and beef, and also salt fish. And of course, high carbohydrate foods that gave energy so that they can do the work on the plantations. We, the descendants of slaves, are left a legacy of ill health in the form of high blood pressure and diabetes as a result of that diet. We now suffer from these illnesses at a much higher percentage than whites and blacks who are not from the Caribbean diaspora. It is now claimed that over 60% of the Black people in the Caribbean who are over the age of 60 suffer from one or both of these illnesses. Hypertension and diabetes are actually considered to be at an epidemic rate in the Caribbean, the Americas, and in Britain, in the descendants of slaves communities. So slavery is still killing descendants of slaves. What did the former colonial islands end up with? Poverty. That's all, poverty. The people in the end had to flee the islands in search of a better life in Britain and the Americas, and anywhere an industrial environment existed that can provide a sustainable economy, processing the same base products from the Caribbean. Blacks sit at the bottom of the economic structure because they had to give away over 300 years of unpaid labor. Blacks didn't get compensation. They got sentenced to hard labor because even after slavery was abolished, they still had to give half of their working week for nothing. The whites sit at the top because they got labor for over 300 years and reparation as well, or the slave owners got the reparation. And that wealth remains with us today in our societies. The islands got nothing but failing crops when the annual season of hurricanes sweep through the islands. Hunger and starvation, as most of their foods have to be imported. Sustained ill health in the form of high blood pressure and diabetes. And underdeveloped countries with poor infrastructure, lacking advanced health care, and a community that depends almost solely on the government for employment. These should be enough to justify reparation. Britain needs to return to the islands and help to fix these issues themselves by directly funding the answers to the ills they are left behind. Set up decent hospitals and sustain them. Build roads. Treat the sick who are suffering from hypertension and diabetes and other illnesses directly related to the slavery legacy. They should also help to set up sustainable industries. Build decent housing, because there are still areas in all the islands where housing is totally well below par. It should also help to move the people out of subsistence living into humane living. Give people hope so that the people want to stay in their islands, work in their islands because they're jobs, and enjoy the tourist view of idyllic in their own islands. This situation was created by Britain, and Britain owes the islands and the people of the islands justice. That is why I believe reparation is a necessity by Britain.
Thank you very much, Clyde. Really enjoyed listening to that very passionate speech. And guys, again, and I keep saying this, we really want to have your questions and have a nice discussion to round off this debate. Finally, I would like to invite Cassandra, who's also a member of my team at the Association of Former British Colonies, and she's going to present a perspective that is often overlooked, and I will leave Cassandra to explain more about that.
Thank you, James, for that lovely introduction. So I was asked by James to present the Indo-Caribbean experience and story as in favor to why I choose to believe that reparations are due by Britain to the Caribbean, specifically in Guyana, and mainly a lot of other Caribbean nations. Now, it's very easy to look at the question of reparations and you have so many figures, you have stats, you have things that countries have gone through. But as an Indo-Caribbean woman who was a product of Guyanese parents who was raised their whole life in Guyana, they were colonized by the British, yet their ancestors can be traced in India. And I was raised in New York City. It's a little bit of a various mix. And it's the best way you can look at it is through experience. So I was first generation born in my family in America. And I was lucky enough to be born in an area of New York City where it was predominantly West Indian and Caribbean. So I always went to schools where people knew about my culture and I learned about other people's culture. And growing up, my mom and my parents, especially my mom, was always like, you are a colored woman growing up in America. So the whole time I'm just like, my mom was just saying that because she wants to make sure we're okay, we understand things. but I did not understand what that meant to be a minority until I went into college. And I went to a private institution in New York City, in Queens, the most diverse borough in the entire city, and I was still considered a minority. And then when I say that I'm West Indian, I have Indian colleagues and classmates who said I'm not Indian enough because I'm from West Indies. And because my ancestors were taken from the motherland, taken from India, we ended up being tainted because of how our Indian culture was translated in the Caribbean. Now, that very much crossed me as very rude, and I was very taken back because I've always considered myself West Indian. I understood that there was a difference between East Indians and West Indians, but then why is it considered that I'm not Indian enough to other Indians? When culturally, even though granted my family, we were raised Christian, there are many Indo-Caribbeans who practice Hinduism, who practice Islam, but yet we're still not considered Indian enough. Yes, I don't personally know Hindi, but I know that my grandfather studied Hindi, studied Urdu, but that still did not make him Indian enough because he was born and raised in Guyana. But that, again, sparked my interest in studying into British Empire and how exactly that translates into my life. Growing up, I always studied world history. I would learn about the history of the African continent. I would learn about the Indian history. And we learn in American education through advanced placement world history about British colonialism. It was briefly talked about in our regular American history as to how it was called, how Britain colonized America, but it didn't go into the British Empire colonial powers and its colonial events, except until you go into advanced history, which again, that's another conversation for another time, but that's how I learned about it. And then still within that narrative, no one spoke about the Caribbean. No one spoke about the British Empire's actions within the Caribbean, but I knew that Britain colonized many aspects of the Caribbean, as well as France, Portugal, and other European powers. But that was not spoken about. And so within that narrative, I conducted my own research. And there is so much that even within the Caribbean nations, you still see the effects of how colonialism has affected the way just simply people think. For example, you would be in the Caribbean, you have profound academics who would teach at the University of West Indies, the most prominent university system within the region. And yet, unless they hold a degree from America or from a European power, especially when it's looked highly upon when you get it from England or France or Germany or places like this, you're not considered qualified enough to teach at that university. When you're growing up, I have my cousin-in-law, she recently came, she married my cousin and she recently came to America. She was telling me when she's in school, they are told that they should take the SATs, they should take certain tests because it'll look more favorable to them when they apply to schools in America or in England or in France. There is systematically a brain drain within the region. When you are taking away the academics, the intelligence within a nation, how do you expect that region to prosper? And again, you can trace all of that back to how colonialism, the British Empire, affected it. You have people who, there was a whole hierarchy set where you have the Europeans, then you have when you have the indentured servants, which was how the Indians were brought over. We were brought over as indentured service, and then you have the slaves, where the Afro-Caribbeans, the Africans, were brought over. Then once the Europeans left, there was a power vacuum. So then you have immense fighting between the ethnicities that were left. So you have the Indians, you have the Afro-Caribbeans, but you also have the native indigenous population. So sometimes we call it Buck people, but they're indigenous people in the region. And they were all vying for that power, that system that was left, that vacuum that was left from the British. Today in Guyana, you have the political parties based on race And yet it's that mindset, that idea that certain races are superior than the other, which can be traced back to the British Empire. Now with the formulation of the United Nations and also CARICOM, which is the Organization of Caribbean Nations, there was formed a committee known as the CARICOM Reparations Commission. Their main goal is to establish the moral, ethical, and legal case for the payment of reparations by the governments of Great Britain, of the Netherlands, of France, of Spain, Portugal, Norway, and Sweden. And most recently, I also heard about Germany now too. They all sent this great letters, this demand of payment letter to all of these nations. By right, the nation that was most responsive to this letter was the nation of Great Britain. Britain then ended up responding by investing within the Caribbean region, and especially in countries like Jamaica, Guyana, and Trinidad, the largest countries that they had colonized, as well as some regions, Barbados, but it's primarily in those three countries. According to the New York Times, Britain invested roughly £300 million into the United Kingdom Caribbean Infrastructure Partnership, which is basically a partnership that creates buildings and infrastructures within the Caribbean regions. Additionally, they also focused on fighting crime within the Caribbean region. Now, some may argue that at the same time, that's something that helps out the British people as well, because there are so many Caribbean individuals living in the region of Great Britain and the UK as a whole, that when they are criminalized and when they're put into the British penal system, they are then deported back to their home country, whether it is Guyana, whether it is Trinidad, whether it is Jamaica. Currently, there are over 1,000 Caribbean nationals within the British penal system. Once they are in this penal system, they are then shipped back. So what the British government decided to do was push money and as an aspect to be like, we are fighting crime within the region. But they are doing this by building prisons that they are sending these same Caribbean nationals that are within their borders back to what they consider their home country. But how is that helping the Caribbean region? That is just instead putting criminals back into that region. And scholars argue these criminals have not perpetrated the crime on Caribbean soil. They tend to be people who have grown up in Britain and then they are shipped back to Guyana, but they don't have any actual roots in Guyana. All their family is in Britain and now America. So what are they doing there? There is no reason for them to be there. All of this wraps up into why Britain should still be paying reparations. You have whole generations not understanding their roots. They don't understand where they came from. They have such a disconnect between Guyana, from Trinidad, from Barbados, from Jamaica, because they are raised within these systems that are not even taught. Because you're simply in schools, you're not taught about colonial history of how deep it ran. And there was a whole article about how you can tell and you can talk about the history of Great Britain and simply mention colonialism. But you cannot speak about the history of Guyana. You cannot speak about the history of Trinidad, Jamaica, Barbados, India, Africa without speaking about colonialism. That is impossible, and you will never get away from that narrative. And within all of this, this is why Britain should be paying reparations, because of just how much they have robbed culturally, mentally, and even physically from those regions and those nations.
Thank you very much, Cassandra. I really enjoyed hearing your speech there. Now, we have some questions from our audience, and I would like to read the first question that we had. Any of our speakers, feel free to answer this question. What is the current UK response in regards to reparations regarding the evidence that has been discussed today? Can anybody answer that question?
I'd really love to jump in. My glasses. Right, because for a while I was there sitting. Thank you, Cassandra. That perspective was lovely. I just needed to probably clarify based on my own knowledge. I know my flyer is up, but I work in reparation, and so I do research towards reparation. To my knowledge, I heard the conversation about Britain responding to reparation. To my knowledge, Britain has never been favorable towards reparation, not even an apology. And maybe that's why I started out my presentation. Well, I think in the middle by saying reparation is not handout, reparation is not aid, and reparation is not loan, because we do not accept a loan or aid or whatever arrangement as reparation. To date, there has been no European country, apart from Scotland, if my memory serves me correctly, the Glasgow University kind of collaboration and UWI. There's no European nation, to my knowledge, and I stand corrected by probably new research. There's no reparation package towards us. There was a time when David Cameron came and James mentioned it and told us to get over it. And then there was a discussion about collaboration and building prisons in Jamaica and stuff. We didn't accept it. Let us just be clear. There was a conversation going on. There was no accepting of it. There's a reference to the letters, and clearly you are onto something, because I probably too might have known, but I can tell you, we don't have any such collaboration and reparation. Nobody actually up to today faced up to reparation.
Okay, Cassandra, you wanted to respond to Natassia?
Yes, absolutely. Thank you so much for your comment, Natassia. And yes, I do stand corrected. It was not reparations. They offer these things, but again, it was not under the name of reparations. They offered it as far as accepting it. Some Caribbean nations have, in the case of Jamaica, with the building of prison systems, there were certain prisons that were set up and established, but they were not all accepted for certain regions. But again, like, there are things that, again, they won't call it reparations, because like many of our speakers have said, by calling it reparations, it opens itself up to numerous issues and numerous, you can say, court appeals and things like that within the system. So again, from my research, this is what we have gathered. But again, I'm always open to different discussions and different perspectives. So I really do appreciate that clarification.
And does this, so on this point then, I would like to bring in our other speakers. Does this pose the question then about the type of reparations? Because judging from what I've heard Vidhu, what you said earlier, you mentioned that this could lead to a problem of countries simply suing each other. But what if we were to talk about non-monetary reparations? What do you think about that?
I completely agree with that, actually, because I'm delighted to say that the presentations by Clyde, Pyle, and Cassandra have made a real impression on me in terms of me understanding that my case is weaker than theirs. So what I would like to offer is that instead of talking about reparations, we should be talking about reparative justice, which was a point that I made earlier. Anyway, and for example, Clyde talked about this sugar plantation that is still owned by a British MP. I mean, that's shocking. I did not know that. But I think the main, one of the main thrusts we should be taking is education and history. Because I think Geeta Lal made the point about education. Do you know that in former colonies, the version of history taught today in India, for example, in schools, is a set of lies agreed? You know, it is, the history has been written by the invaders, and that's still what is taught. And I'm sure this is true for the rest of the colonies, that how can things possibly change when new generations are being fed a pack of lies? And so, you know, that to my mind is something that is extremely important, not just in the colonies, but also in the guilty colonizers, because they don't teach anything about the true history of what was perpetrated. So I certainly do agree that reparative justice should be agitated for. We should continue to keep, strenuously arguing for that. And we may get somewhere, because what's going to frighten the lives out of the opposition is asking for trillions of pounds. But let's concentrate on the low-hanging fruit and try and get some redress, which is of a non-financial type, but certainly in terms of correcting historical wrongs would be a very productive way of going forward.
Thank you. Before I bring Robert in, because he just made a comment, I wanted to ask Geeta. Geeta, we're talking about the potential of non-monetary reparations. You mentioned the partition and the psychological trauma that I suppose now Indians and Pakistanis who were victims of the partitions has faced. What can be done in your mind, or do you think that money is the only way of solving it?
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting question, and thank you for asking. I think really the comments you made were really interesting as well. So I do think education definitely is one way, but I do think ultimately my conclusion to reparations in general, in my own head, is that as much as we want reparations, I think ultimately what will happen is that we'll dismantle racism and maybe dismantle some of the oppressive systems that have been in place from colonialism. And I think that's what will be seen as reparations. But in reality, that shouldn't have been there in the first place. That's not a reparation in itself. And I think that's the issue. I think that's a starting place, dismantling racism and giving people better opportunities. But I think all of that is a cause of what happened in the first place. Bringing it back isn't going to solve anything. If I stole £1 million and caused a family multiple deaths and starvation, giving them their £1 million back is not going to resolve everything I've done, right? And so I think that's the ultimate issue, is that we need to do more than just undoing, because there's now scars. To this day, we have colorism, we have these wars at the border and all that kind of stuff. But I do think that as well as the stuff of education, for example, and like when you look at like the Caribbean, for example, I had a friend from Trinidad and Tobago who said that they were actually taught about colonization and about how their position in the world today and how Britain played a part in that and why their position is the way it is, and etc. and all of that. And they were taught all of that. You talk about when you look at Trevor Noah, who's a comedian in America, originated from South Africa. He said that when he came to England, he was amazed about our education, about how we were taught that we conquered South Africa and we were the heroes. And it was like, no, we didn't. We came there with guns and knives and murdering and raping and all this kind of stuff. But the way we're educated, and I was educated to think, oh my gosh, I'm so proud to be British. I live in a place that we took over the world, yes. And then I learned that racism and was like, what kind of propaganda is this that you're teaching me, that I should be proud to be a part of a country that took over my ancestors' country, abused them and all of that. So I think that's part of it. But I think ultimately we can't get away from the fact that just because we say we can't afford it, if it was outside of a country scenario, it was two people and someone murdered a family, you're going to have to pay for that. Ultimately, you're not just going to be like, okay, but we can't afford it. Well, you're going to have to over a certain amount of times, but there will be other ways we can do that.
And I suppose some may say that if there it can be reparations for slave owners, for example, then why can't there be reparations for the descendants of slaves? I want to bring Robert Williams in here because you've just made some very interesting comments in our chat that our audience can't see. So I would like you to unmute your mic and to expand on that, please.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes, yes.
Okay, so James, what exactly was your question?
So you've made a comment in our chat here. It says reparations comes from repair. So reparative justice is what reparations seek. Monetary payments or annuities too often extend the problem rather than provide a solution. I was wondering if you could expand on that a bit more, please.
So this history of annuities, it's a tool that for hegemony that British Empire used back in the 1700s to pay different groups in India, and then later different nations in North America. And that way they could get people dependent on their handouts, and then they would stand down in the opposition. That's not reparation. Paying out money, you could end up like Native Americans today on a reservation, dependent on government handouts. That's not a way forward. That is a way of paying you off, sitting at home in front of your TV or your what's it called, Xbox, and just leave us alone. That's not a solution. A reparation repairs the damage that people are suffering today, embedded in the structures and artifacts around us. They're all unjust, and they continue to perpetuate this, like Clyde so eloquently pointed out.
Vidya, I'm aware that you've got your hand up, but I want to bring in Natesia here. Natesia, how would you respond to what Robert's just said there?
I was just typing.
Okay.
I hear the sentiments, and I'm always grateful for listening to differing views. Differing it is, because I believe that if we are going to really be fair to the process, we have to really look at what we as lawyers, I don't know how many lawyers are among us, but certainly it's a craft of mine, and I have to utilize it. We never go to court and just pull something out of a hat unless we're the judge making precedents and using a common law precedent. It means that when we're making decisions, at best, we look to similar situations. I have mentioned Nazi Germany and how Germany paid $60 billion in reparation for something as atrocious, whatever the word persons want to call it. They can all agree that that was heinous, that was genocide, that was everything that was wrong. And today, we are all comfortable with that payment. We have identified a longer span of atrocity, the most inhumane thing that has ever happened over a protracted period of time to any set of people without comparison. We have been steadfast in uncovering the evidence year after year, time after time. The CARICOM Reparatory Justice Thrust identified 10 points of what I wouldn't say contention, but what we put forward to say, this is the route that we're taking. They have sat down time and time again and look at the most suitable package to compensate. Let us be clear. The $2.5 trillion that was mentioned, let me put it in figures. The $2.5 trillion that Britain and the British government and the people of Britain finished paying back in 2015 was a figure that they could all agree on, because the planters were humans and people who were worth that compensation. I want to make that clear. And I'm speaking like this because of how I feel, so forgive me. I gesticulate, because at some point we need to really, even not for us, even if we can't, but look at what's in front of us, is all I'm asking. So 46,000 enslavers were compensated in 46,000, sorry, enslavers were compensated $20 million. Jamaica alone, and we could trace all the enslavers from Jamaica to Britain. They're identifiable. Jamaica alone was 4.1, call it whatever it is, but located to $3 billion. That's what they got. They also got all sorts of other consideration, apprenticeship, and you're trying to tell me, and I'm saying you in a very broad way, that we cannot agree that the people who were taken forcefully, that's why I keep saying enslaved and not slaves, because they were not slaves, they were enslaved.
Yes.
The people who had a condition of freedom before they were taken, forcibly removed from their homeland, brought to another area, worked, not collecting a dime, murdered, slaughtered, all the things you can tell are not worth a penny. I'm just trying to understand. And I'm very, very, very disappointed in, if there's no literature, I'm disappointed in that, because it's staring us right in the face. And I'll close by saying, because I know I'll close by saying the past is not so far removed. If you look in 1998, Britain just repealed the Abolition Act quietly. Just repeal it, 1998. And when some small portions of people had a conversation about why repealing it, is it that we're back in slavery? They said, oh no, we have the Human Rights Act that would prevent any sort of atrocity from taking place. Just 1998. It's not so far removed. I'm just saying, it's right there.
Thank you very much, Natesia. I want to bring in Vidhu. He's been waiting very patiently. Vidhu, how would you respond?
Yeah, the point that I wanted to make was that I've already mentioned about reparative justice in terms of religious evangelism, and then the changing of educational systems, the historiography. But I think it's also important to remember that when we talk about independence of the former colonies, I would actually assert India did not become independent in 1947 because actually that was a transfer of power. And I would assert that India became independent in 2014 because that's when the legacy of externally foisted systems was started to be dismantled. The language, English, the Supreme Court of India still up to today will not hear any cases in any Indian language, only English. So, you know, we've got to remember that it is going to take years for these colonies, ex-colonies to recover, because the same would apply, you know, I mean, this nonsensical argument about we gave you the trains. There's the example of my grandfather. He was lucky. 1,500 of those Indian coolies that built that railway line in 5 years died out of 35,000. That is a higher mortality rate than is for COVID, to put into context. So there is so much that needs to be done in helping the recovery of these former colonies in terms of restoration of their original culture, traditions, value systems, language, systems of education, and spirituality. It's a big, big, massive project that needs to be attacked and you know, fought for.
Thank you. I want to bring in Robert now. Robert, I think you made a comment, I think that was in response to Natesia, about the 3%. So could you expand on that, please? If you just unmute your microphone, we can't hear you at the moment. Robert, if you just unmute your microphone, we can't hear you. Thank you.
Sorry. So Natesia said the slave owners didn't get finished being compensated. Well, we haven't paid back the loan in the UK until 2015. That was compensation to slave owners, but that law was not passed by the British people. That law was passed by the voting 3%. The 97% without the vote until 1867 did not make that reparation law, but they had to pay for it until 2015 and their descendants. White people in England did not get the right to vote until 1867. And that's what we keep forgetting about in this dialogue. They were victims too.
Natesia, how would you respond to that statement?
As far as I'm concerned, it's semantics. Let me just lay it out like that. Semantics. It's a British government that we're having a conversation about. British government. The same British government who decided, and I'm saying government because I'm not peopling this conversation. It's a government that did something, and we're looking to the same government. Whether it's the same body that is in parliament or another body, we're asking the same people who set up that scheme to run it through and set up another scheme to pay us what we are owed. I am not going to do the semantics because we can always do that. I'm sure that some of my learned friends in Jamaica right now in crafting our case, they are getting very deep in the case and they can identify legislations and all of that. I'm not doing this here. I'm really just trying to say it's the same parliament that had the power in 1998 to repeal the Abolition Act. The Abolition Act was just repealed in 1998. I have gone and done my research. I've read through it. I looked through the conversation, the Hansard, to look at what they're reasoning. A matter of fact, there was not even much reasoning on it. It wasn't even that important. It was done in a very piecemeal way, where 11 Slave Trade Act. Some of my colleagues didn't even know that Britain has 11 slave trade acts on book, some of them still relevant today because it touches and concerns shipping.
Yes.
Some were repealed, some were amended, some are still on books today. It was done in such a piecemeal way that even if we were put back in slavery, we could not have known how it was done quietly. I'm simply saying the British government we're having a conversation about. We can then get into semantics and talk about whether we're talking about the Queen being the monarch who has responsibility for both the British government in that time and the colonies. Because these are legal semantics that we are actually interrogating. And I can go through it at another forum. I'm just saying that is semantics. That is it.
I want to bring in Cassandra now here. Now, Naticia, in your initial presentation, you talked about African Caribbean suffering. You talked about indigenous suffering. Cassandra,
Right.
what about Indo-Caribbeans? Are they too owed reparations?
Absolutely. So for the Indo-Caribbeans, it was framed in different manners. So as far as how you're going to come over to the Caribbean, it was framed to many families and many people, and they tended to be of poorer class and things like that. Okay, we have this opportunity. You go on this boat, and it'll be a great time, and all you have to do is work off the price and the payment for this boat. Now, then it started becoming attractive to other intellectuals and other people of higher status, and most of us here are familiar with the caste system in India. So people of higher caste systems that saw this opportunity as lucrative. They're like, we can bring over our families and things like that, and we create a whole new life for ourselves. However, the life that they were promised was not what they received when they landed in the Caribbean. Absolutely not. They faced not just a whole annihilation of their culture, they also faced a lot of that indentured servitude. It was literally just a title. It was the same conditions throughout for both slaves and indentured servants. The women were raped. Then you had the rise of a mixed class of people who were then both European and Indo-Caribbean. Then you had the Indo-Caribbeans and the Afro-Caribbeans mixing as well. And so they were considered another class. And even today you have, we call them Dougla, but you have a mix of Caribbean and Afro-Caribbean people. And then you still have the mix of the European and Indo-Caribbean descent and the European and Afro-Caribbean descent. But they're considered a higher class just because of that they have half, they can potentially trace it back to half European, which is ridiculously wrong. And then when they were brought over as indentured servitudes, you can also see Geeta mentioned colorism. That is so prevalent within the region there, because just because you are a lighter brown, you're seen as smarter, you're seen as superior. You were then seen as what we consider like the house servant. You can be brought forth when the Europeans are entertaining their other European friends because you look a lot more appealing to them. And that was not just within the Afro-Caribbean community, that is within the Indo-Caribbean culture today. Like, it is still seen as the lighter you are, the more beautiful you are. And that's not right. Absolutely not. That has no bearing on someone's intelligence, no bearing on someone's worthwhileness. It's just how your genes are mixed together. But that was still seen and prevalent in Indo-Caribbean culture back then and still today. And so there has been so many wrongs done. People would always talk about gold. Now, gold is something that has always been really affiliated with India. When the Indo-Caribbeans were brought over, it was also something that they brought over. Well, culturally, the gold means something. For example, I have what's considered a sovereign, which is an Indian gold coin from my great-grandmother. That is something that was passed down to one of her granddaughters, and then her granddaughter passed it on to me. So that is still considered lucrative. It was gold, it was carried down and is passed down, and it's still something that's a family momentum. And things like this, the gold that was there, it was harvested from them, it was taken away from them. And then once the Europeans left, it was a matter of contention between the Afro-Caribbeans, the Indo-Caribbeans, and the indigenous people about who this gold belongs to. And it's like, okay, like it was mined by different people, it was mined and it was taken away, but all this gold was then given to the Europeans. It was like the scraps that were left, and that's what they're finding for. But the great mining of the gold that was done years before the Europeans left. But yet they had to face the consequences. They had to deal with all the conflict that arose for those scraps of gold that were left. And that was, again, you can again trace that back to what the British Empire perpetrated on the region. Okay. And people can easily be like, oh no, this is how Indo-Caribbeans think, and this is how Afro-Caribbean people think, and then when you put it in terms of this is how Kuli people think, this is how Buck people think, and it's like, no, you have systems that have implemented these ideas within them, and it's not, granted, it is their fault if they want to continue in such a manner, but if they were not educated and if they don't know better, what else are they going to do? They have no other choice in that sense.
Okay, I want to probe you a bit more, and then I want to bring in Geeta and Vidhu because I'm aware you guys are waiting very patiently. Natesia, Robert's just raised a really interesting point in our chat. Did not the Indians come to the Caribbean as families rather than individual property of a slave owner? So there was a contrast, it seems, between the Indo-Caribbean experience and the African Caribbean experience. But are both communities still due reparations, in your opinion, or not?
Well, I have always advocated, based on our position in the Caribbean, we talk about the genocide of the indigenous people. We talk about the indigenous people's cause, and we also talk about the transatlantic slave trade, just chattel slavery. From a human rights attorney perspective, there's no ill treatment of humans that can just pass for me. You understand? So let's say it like that. We are aware, historically speaking, when I study history, I have had cause to study the indentureship period, and it was rough, absolutely. I believe that whatever the presentation was as was the case. So if there is sufficient evidence, and I'm saying if there's sufficient evidence because I have not personally gone through to look at the evidence there to then make the case. It doesn't mean, however, that there is not a case. It's just that based on how I approach scholarly activity, I want to be able to say, this is the case and this is why. As to abuse, of course, as to all the deficiencies when you promise a job and return passage and all of that, and I think Professor Shepard wrote a book, Mahara's Misery, that's a good go-to. I can say that maybe that's going to make the case, but I have not sufficiently dealt with it. What I can say, however, that, and it's not because I'm African, the transatlantic slave trade, the chattel slavery, is incomparable.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, that's just the truth.
I'm aware I want to get all of our speakers speaking. I'm really enjoying this conversation. Clyde, if you want to say something, please just let me know. I want to bring in Geeta next. And Geeta, what would you like to say?
Yeah, I think someone mentioned the Queen. Apologies, I forgot who mentioned it, but someone mentioned the Queen in this. And I think I am a firm believer that the royal family, historically and to this day, are responsible for a lot of what's happened in terms of enslavement, in terms of indentured service, in terms of the whole British Empire and colonialism. To this day, we're still, I don't believe a lot of previous colonies are independent, because they're still part of the Commonwealth. I don't think that's true independency. And so the fact that we believe that the Queen is non-partisan and that she really shouldn't make any judgment, and this is the will of the people. I'm sorry, the will of the people might say, yeah, we want enslavement, we want racism, we want all of this, but you've still got to take some responsibility as a person that the end book, the book ends with you, basically. You've got to sign these laws. And so I think there really is something to be said about not only the country, but the royal family individually making reparations. And I really do think that the royal family in general should be dismantled. And that might have some uproaring with a lot of British people, but I think that it's historically a family that have enforced this racism. But yeah, that on that part, and I think also, yeah, the Indian gold. I know that personally myself as well. In the family, we've got it. It's not only a monetary value; it is a personal value. It's something that you bring down to your daughters, and even to this day in India, there's a huge amount of value in the Indian gold within the women of India, because it's passed through the female line, which is very contradictory to the values of India in terms of hierarchy, in terms of the sexism and stuff, but the gold always goes through the women. But yeah, absolutely. I think that the royal family need to be given reparations. I don't know in what form. I think monetary, they have a lot of money, they can do that. But I also think that just through their serving, they're supposed to be serving the people and serve the Commonwealth, serve the countries that were previously colonizing, that you previously colonized, instead of just turning up and maybe doing bits and bobs. Do something more. I just don't think they're doing enough. And yeah, refurbishing the palace doesn't need to be done. We need to be giving money and real making some real changes to the countries that you've destroyed, and you've had a massive hand in doing so.
Thank you very much. Vidu, I would like to bring you in now.
Yeah, thanks. Just a brief counter argument to Robert's point about 3% of people making the political decision. I reject that, because although the 97% may not have voted, they most definitely benefited from decades and centuries of plunder and loot, because the GDPs of these colonizing nations rose directly through theft, essentially. And so they might not have voted for some of the abominable legislation, but they've benefited. And so similarly, when we talk about holding the Queen and aristocrats accountable, you have to hold nation states accountable as they are today, not try and find layers in amongst that who are accountable, because that's how the world is run. The UK as it is today as a nation is to blame, and whatever actions it needs to take, it cannot wriggle out of by arguing, well, actually, my ancestors didn't vote for this. Sorry. In fact, as some slight redress, those of us who have been able to immigrate into the UK have benefited indirectly from the loot, because that's a major reason why these countries in Europe and the USA are so much wealthier than those in developing countries.
Yeah, and perhaps you can see that in the difference between white settler colonies, Australia, Canada, USA, obviously being a former white settler colony, and how they seem to be economically prosperous, whereas others would say that the non-white settler colonies perhaps have had the worst end of it. I don't know. I'm impartial. I'm the host at the moment. I want to bring in Robert to respond to you, and then we're going to sort of we're going to take a question, and then we're going to summarize. So Robert, how would you respond to what Vidu just came back with?
Well, thank you for asking, but Clyde had his hand raised, and I'll answer after Clyde.
Okay. Well, I was actually going to ask our audience a question to Clyde, first of all.
Okay, let Robert go, and then I'll take the questions. But before I do, I will just make a couple of small comments.
Of course, yes. Yes, go ahead, please.
Oh, okay. Look, I think we have to recognize that this question of reparation was never going to be an easy one. And I think in terms of cash, it's always emotive because people see a bundle of cash moving from one position to another. And I think that's what we have to remove from our heads. Let's try to examine the problem of what has happened and then try to find a solution. Reparation is about making good the wrong. And what we must do is try to understand. We are not saying we want X amount of cash. We want things corrected, however that comes. But if we're going to talk about cash, let's recognize and accept the fact that to this very day, Jews across the world are being paid cash by Germany as reparation for their experience during the war. So don't fixate on cash, fixate on the solution to the problem. And if that means cash, well, so be it. But I think maybe I get too emotive in this because I am a descendant of slaves. The pressure, the problems I've lived through. I was born almost into the slavery. I have family. I have a auntie, 100 years old. And she remembered things, although it wasn't slavery then when she was born, but she remembered things her parents told her about slavery. Because although they say slavery ended in 1834, the reality is the practice continues without recognition. And I think what we have to do is try and find a solution to solving the ills of slavery.
So if we talk about a modern sense then, and this is where I can bring in our question from the audience, what exactly is the Commonwealth? So let's bring it forward to the 21st century. Clyde, what is the Commonwealth?
Well, the Commonwealth is an organization that's been brought together from the ex-colonies. Some, well, most of them are now independent, some are republics, but they remain as this Commonwealth. I think it's a creation that was intended to keep the presence of the Queen as head of state, irrespective of whether you're a republic, an independent, or whether you're still under the control of the British government. That's all I think it is.
Robert, what would you say the Commonwealth is in your understanding?
Well, I think Clive is doing a great job of explaining everything, and I would be pretty much echoing him. Yeah, so the Queen of England and Australia and Canada and about 12 other countries is exactly that. she's not just a figurehead, though. I remember in 2008 when the latest financial recession hit. Harper, the Prime Minister of Canada, approached the Queen to suspend the Canadian Parliament. So she did. She still has great power. And Clyde alluded to that. We talk about decolonialism, but shouldn't we be talking about neocolonialism? I'll just leave it at that.
Vidhu, you're nodding your head. Do you agree with that statement? You need to
unmute.
Yeah, absolutely. Neocolonialism is still going on, and it's dreadful. I mentioned that as well earlier, and I mean, I agree totally with Robert that Clyde has been such a wonderful speaker today in terms of speaking from the heart and with complete integrity on ways to go forward. I really think what resonates with me is when he says, make good the wrong. Don't fixate on cash, fixate on the solution. And so, if need be, we need a bit of both, but we certainly need to make good the wrong. Well said, Clyde.
But Natasha,
I think if I may, James.
Of course, yes.
If I can just tap on something Robert said about the Queen dissolving Parliament in Australia, she could only do that under the invitation of the government there. She has no power to move in on her own because that would be an act of war. So therefore, she has to be invited to sign a document and say Parliament dissolved.
So there's still a lot of power there that we can see. Natasha, I want to answer this final question from our audience before we summarize. What role does Britain play in countries such as Jamaica today?
Well, I started out in my presentation by highlighting that Britain is still the constitutional monarch. So we still have Britain as the head of state. Technically, we have a Governor General of Jamaica that is the representative of Britain, who sits in high places and opens Parliament, closes Parliament, governs the National Heroes Day celebration, everything that has to do with the role of the external head of state. Britain is still here. We have a kind of parliamentary system that still is stuck in that mold. So unlike Barbados, that is moving now towards a republic where they will essentially get rid of the Queen, we have not yet made that step. So as it stands, it gives us, without saying too much, that structure also now would probably give a sort of way then to have a conversation still, because you're not a colony, but you're still connected with the monarch, so to speak, unfortunately.
Thank you. I'm going to go through each speaker and I'm going to ask you guys to give me a 60-second summary. Geeta, does Britain owe reparations? Yes or no?
Absolutely. We owe reparations because there's too much that we've done in our past that would equate to monetary value, as well as opportunities and other ways that we can give reparations. I think ultimately, for anyone that doesn't believe in reparations, I would say if your family member was murdered, but you didn't realize they were murdered until years later, it got to court at that point, would you then say, well, actually, I don't deserve reparations because it was that long ago? I think and B as well, I don't think it was that long ago, all of the different ways that we need to give reparations to several different countries. And the Commonwealth is just one example of how we've been able to keep control in these countries, where they're part of this bigger thing, a bigger community, or whatever you want to call Commonwealth. But India to this day have got some of the some of the hardest places to get visas to the UK. I think what's really astonishing is that Germany, a country that tried to take over England through Nazis, finds it easier to get to the UK than countries like India, who came to the UK to help us during the wartime. So I think that's just one example of why we deserve reparations as a country.
Thank you very much. Clyde, does Britain owe reparations?
I think the answer to that is obviously yes. And I think I've made my points very clear as to why. And I would argue with anyone who says no, simply because no fair-minded thinking person can legitimately say that the inhumane behavior, the dehumanization of a race of people is not worthy of compensation.
Very much, Clyde. Right within the 60-second limit. Thank you. Cassandra, does Britain owe reparations?
Without a doubt. You have people like me and obviously like this rising generation where we're bringing to light more and more every day the wrongs that have been done with simple movements like Me Too and now reparations, which is definitely making headlines and things like that. But it needs to be spoken about. A lot of our generation, we were taught that no, you just keep your heads down and you like this is like the price you pay for coming to America or going to the UK. And no, it's not. Like our ancestors did work. They worked hard and fought to get to this country, fought to get to America, fought to get to the UK. They don't need to put their heads down. They need to stand up. And even if they won't, then there's our generation and people like us, all who are here, who's saying like, no, something needs to be done. And it's not okay to just lie down and just take it anymore.
Robert, does Britain owe reparations?
So there's a lot of people who haven't muted themselves, and that's why we had trouble hearing Cassandra. I answered that, I think, initially. I said the only just system of compensation as reparations is one that does not force those who had no vote, no say, nothing to do with the laws that created slavery, having to pay damages. That 3% who alone made all these laws, did slavery up until 1867, who selected the members of parliament that crafted all of this and approved those reparations to the slave owners for giving up slaves. Their beneficiaries today should be the ones to dip into their pockets to fund these yet to be decided reparations. Forcing descendants of non-African victims of the 3% to fund the African victims of the 3% seems unjust. This, in a nutshell, is the case against British people owing reparations as it is currently conceived. But yeah, go after that 3%. They deserve it.
Vidu, does Britain owe reparations?
Oh, most definitely, which is why I quoted Will Durant. I think the larger question is, should they be paid? And we've already addressed this. Today is an educational event, and I think more important than my original opinions are the greater truths I've learned today. And I've already mentioned the ones that I've learned from Clyde. But to wrap up with, I think a new point that I haven't made before in agreement is that maybe these ridiculous constitutions that have been left in the parliaments need to be changed. You know, very few people know that the Indian constitution is essentially a copy, cut and paste job of the 1935 India Act enacted by the British when they were still there. And you know, it just needs to rip the whole thing up and starting from a blank page. These are the sort of things we certainly need to do. And yes, in some cases, financial reparation should be paid if it's easily doable.
Thank you. And the final word goes to Natesia. Natesia, does Britain owe reparations?
Well, absolutely. 400 years of reparation. But if you want to just talk about during the slave trade, 183 years of unpaid labor, 46,000 thousand compensation was given to 46,000 enslavers, sorry, were given compensation. We believe that 15 million Africans and their descendants are due compensation without a doubt in the trillions. We can put a dollar figure to it. We're not backing down. Money is important. It was important to them. It's important to our development. But also, just to quickly say, not just money. We need a full formal apology. We need repatriation back to Africa. We demand that. We need indigenous peoples enhancement. We need cultural institutions being built. We need a help to the public health crisis that we're facing because of them. We need illiteracy to be eradicated. We also need debt cancellation. Any money that we owe them, we need that to be put aside because they owe us more than we could ever owe them. And that is it.
Thank you very much. To our audience, I hope that you found this debate to be educational and enlightening. I hope that this has informed your opinion and helped to enhance your judgment to help you decide where you stand on the question of whether or not Britain and perhaps other former colonial countries owe reparations. My name is James Boston. I've been your host today. You can get in touch with me at the Association of Former British Colonies Facebook and Instagram and LinkedIn pages where this discussion will be posted. You can also subscribe to our YouTube channel where this debate will be posted that you can view in your own time. Thank you very much. And for myself and all of our guests here, we thank you for tuning in.